I apologize in advance for the confusion. There's been a lot of moving pieces, and I had posted that we were discussing the first half of part two. So there are three parts of this essay that we're reading on the asseveration track, but because it is quite complex syntax, we have broken each section down into two parts. So
Mhm.
myself and Bree were discussing part two of part two, where Spillers is looking back at the life of, oh, how would you say his first name? Aluga
Equian.
Equiano,
Mm-hmm.
the African, written by himself. Yeah, so we're gonna get into the latter half of this section.
The
Wait, there are
connection
four parts.
keeps.
I was not bugging. There's four parts of this essay, so we got a good bit more discussions coming out. Okay, so we're gonna start. I believe we'll probably be starting at the end of page 71 and the conditions of middle passage.
Yes, that sounds.
So I'm gonna just kick this off since this is complex. I'm not gonna say it's complicated. It's complex. It's layered. I'm just gonna start off by reading the first paragraph so we can get into how Spillers is using grammar, is using language, is using stylization to drive her point home. And then we can get in to the questions. But this just helps to like warm everybody up because I know sometimes reading this text, you've read the words and you're not sure what you just read. So let's do this together. So I'm gonna start on this like the very last line on page 71 that starts with the conditions of middle passage. The conditions of middle passage are among the most incredible narratives available to the student, as it remains not easily imaginable. Late in the chronicles of the Atlantic slave trade, Britain's parliament entertained discussions concerning possible regulations for slave vessels. A Captain Perry visited the Liverpool port, and among the ships that he inspected was the Brooks, probably the most well known image of the slave galley, with its representative personae, etched into the drawing like so many cartoon figures. Elizabeth Donnan's second volume carries the Brooks plan along with an elaborate delineation of its dimensions from the investigative reporting of Perry himself. Quoting, "Let it now be supposed, further, that every man slave is to be allowed 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches for room, every woman 5 feet 10 by 1 foot 4, every boy 5 feet by 1 foot 2, and every girl 4 feet 6 by 1 foot." The owner of the Brooks, James Jones, had recommended that 5 females be reckoned as 4 males and 3 boys or girls as equal to the grown persons. And in this, the representative personae is italicized. Person. How do you say that?
Personalized, how I would pronounce
Personae
it. Hmm.
is italicized. Let me bring my mic down so that y'all can actually hear me. Ooh, my battery's about to die. Hold on. We're gonna have a little blackout for 1 second. Well, not entirely, but sorry.
I do appreciate the way Spillers brings to mind the image of the slave ship. I can't hear you, Jouelzy.
Oh,
There
my
we
sound.
go.
Can you hear me now?
Hmm.
Okay. You were saying something about the slave ships.
I appreciate the way that Spillers brings in this image, right? Because when she dubs it the probably the most well-known image of the slave galley, I've definitely seen the image of the Brooks slave ship time and time again, whether it be in historical text on people's people make I think some people have T-shirts with it on there. I know it was on the cover of the Black Scholar in like the 1970s as well.
Yeah, it's featured at the Smithsonian. So the Brooks slave ship is the image that we see of all the bodies drawn
Mhm.
out in the hole. Um, yeah, that just when she's talking about how all this has seeped into our language, into the way we speak about each other, about different ethnicities, about different cultures. It's like, yeah, you don't even realize how much the images that you're already familiar with, how they are compounded within the language and grammar that we use. Did I just sit on her head?
Exactly.
I did.
I'm trying to. So when Spillers asks, what sociocultural function does this failed recognition offer to European nations and culture? Um, I'm thinking also about the part before where you just read on 71, um, where Spillers says, though the notorious middle passage appears to the investigator as a vast background without boundaries in time and space, it remains a opening up of the entire Western Hemisphere for the specific purposes of Zora's natural narrative belongs then to a discourse of appropriation whose strategies will prove fatal to communities along the coastline of West Africa, stretching, according to Alu.
Oh, you froze.
As a project of European enslavement and colonization more than as a real space. Um, and so when Spillers asked what sociocultural function does this failed recognition offer to European nations and culture, I think about how the differences in genetics and cultural practices become the basis of the violence, which she says earlier,
Mm-hmm.
that will rewrite the histories of modern Europe and Black Africa.
Yeah, and then even like if we go back to the very first paragraph of section 2, when she says that the cruelty, or was it the previous line? The narrative of the life of Oluda Aquino, or hi y'all, sorry about that. I don't know what's going on today. That's very odd that my internet just went out. Let me see how this is loading on the YouTube channel. I'm sorry, y'all. It just whole stopped our live, and I don't know why. Okay, here I go. Okay, it seems like it's the same one. We're still in here.
Yeah, somebody said we're back.
Okay, sorry y'all. This has been real. Mercury is not in microbraids, so I don't know who to blame this on. Like I paid my internet bill. Or maybe I didn't. Who knows? Thought I did. I might need to log on to pay Spectrum. I think I put it on auto bill though. That should be auto paid. Okay, sorry y'all. This has been a lot more ghetto than I would have liked it to be. But yeah. So I was just saying how that line had really stuck out to me. And but as her point, as she further pulls out, like who does the language harm, and how does the language like benefit the Europeans, even though you know just as Equano explains in his narrative, like it was jarring to see these white red faces with long hair, but somehow it becomes the African, the captors, or the captivated who are kind of dissembled via language.
And it gets into on page back on page 70, right, when they even get into the language of these three genetic distinctions in that middle paragraph. You're getting this language of racial classifications coming through this this umbrella of genetic distinctions and this early like colonial connection between biology, genetics, and race, which still gets us in pretty murky water in 2021, right? When we think of sort of the afterlives of the Ancestry 23andMe boom a couple years ago, and people still trying to link biology to race, and that's not accurate.
Yeah. You want to read those two paragraphs on page 70?
Starting from there onward, I can.
Or the
Uh,
three genetic distinctions?
yes. All right, three genetic distinctions are available to the Portuguese eye. All along the rifts of melanin in the skin, in a field of captives, some of the observed are, quote, white enough, fair to look upon, and well proportioned, end quote. Others are less, white like mulattoes, and still others are black as Ethiops and so ugly, both in features and in body, as almost to appear, to those who saw them, the images of a lower hemisphere. By implication, this third man, standing for the most abhorrent phenotype to the observant eye, embodies the linguistic community most unknown to the European. Arabic translators among the Europeans could at least talk to the Moors and instruct them to ransom themselves, or else. Typically, there is in this grammar of description the perspective of declension, not of simultaneity, and its point of initiation is so solistipic. It begins with a narrative self and an apparent unity of feeling, and unlike Equianu, who also saw ugly when he looked out, this collective self uncovers the means by which to subjugate the foreign code of conscience, whose most easily remarkable and irredeemable difference is perceived in skin color. By the time of De Azora's mid-15th century narrative, and a century and a half before Shakespeare's Old Black Ram of an Othello Tups, that white hue of a Desdemona, the magic of skin color is already installed as a decisive factor in human dealings. And what Spillers is getting at is the grammars the grammar of these conditions of European conquest, which is already steeped in this grammar, these conditions of anti-blackness,
Yeah,
right?
like,
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, so like when we think about these time markers that she's pulling out, right, and still staying in the realm of English literature, which is Spiller's wheelhouse. So getting into the language of Shakespeare and Othello and these classic European narratives.
Yeah, and it's like, when she says embodies a linguistic community most unknown to the European, like you were saying earlier, how do we even get to say who, like this whole colorism conversation that often gets overtaken, or even like the Afro Latinx conversation that often gets overtaken by people who are racially ambiguous, and we don't actually center the people that whose phenotype is easily described. Um, but so we have these conversations about who gets to define themselves as black.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow black still becomes this, the lowest of the rung, but also the deepest unknown. And
Mm,
so that even being at the bottom cannot hold on to this identity, because it's open, unlike other identities, to other people infiltrating it, because it's the way the language works. So
mm-hmm.
very, Spillers is making a very complex argument, but that is, though, very finite. Like, she's very much so laser focused on what her argument is. And so what makes it complex is that she's just able to pull all these parts of grammar that we've just never considered, and make all these examples to really, employ us to think through how language is part of this white supremacist society that we live in. How we get here, not just through statutes or physical things that are in our material reality, but also through our language. And I think that's what makes it a hard read, but that's also what makes it a very necessary read.
Yeah.
You're
Spillers.
supposed to walk away thinking about what the fuck did I just read? Like,
And spillers is like time and time again, we gotta tackle it at the level of narrative, at language, right? The image of the Brooks slave ship is an image, but it also gave grammar, right? And continues to give us a grammar to try to understand what that journey of the Middle Passage, the violence of the Middle Passage was.
so the next question is, how does ungendering occur within slave ship accounting?
Oh, that's that part you read, that in the that Brooks slave ship. I called
Yeah.
it like a captive mathematics, right? Because it's like this math that doesn't, it's not consistent and it won't be universal, right? But they
Mm-hmm.
talk about 72, the owner of the Brooks, James Jones, had recommended that 5 females be reckoned as 4 males and 3 boys or girls as equal to 2 grown persons. So it's this odd sort of ratio of flesh to flesh that happens. And when you get above that, and it talks about, is that above that? The
Yeah,
quote that the
like
female in the middle passage.
in the next paragraph, she starts off that the scaled inequalities complement the commanding terms of the dehumanizing, ungendering, and defacing project of African persons that Diazora's narrative might have recognized.
Yeah.
And I think like part of what I'm understanding to be Spiller's argument, and often in like the history books that I've read that make a point to talk about black women and the female gender, it's often through the lens of that there was a specific kind of engendered violence.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go back to part one, and she's talking about when she, well, let me not misquote, but how she explains what the utility of gender will be in this essay is that we have to look at gender to understand the the dissembling that happens to the body, right? The dissembling through language, because it's taking body part by body part apart and enacting a particular type of violence, but not because gender really benefits us, not because it's, under being specific or being binary towards any type of gender is a part of our culture or a foundation of who we are, but that is because it's been used to enact a specific type of violence. And so
Yeah.
that's why we have to look at gender within um, this essay.
And the quote that I was looking to pull out is underneath that. It's the third paragraph, the end, um, where she begins, we might say that the slave ship, its crew, and its humanist cargo stand for a wild and unclaimed richness of possibility that is not yet interrupted, not counted, accounted, or differentiated until its movement gains the land thousands of miles away from the point of departure. Under these conditions, one is neither female nor male, as both subjects are taken into account as quantities. The female in the middle passage, as the apparently smaller physical mass, occupies less room in a directly translatable money economy, but she is nevertheless quantifiable by the same rules of accounting as her male counterpart. So that gets back to it, right? Like, as you were speaking to earlier, that gender is not this empowering differentiation for the captives, for the enslaved. It is a metric of how much of your flesh can we squeeze into a section of the ship and commodify. It becomes this tool for the rules of accounting, for the rules of subjection, and the possibility of being made into a human as cargo.
Mm.
Somebody asked, would we say that Spillers was saying that Black people were defrauded of patriarchy and matriarchy due to slavery?
Let me add that question to the screen. My laptop is just over here.
Yeah,
I'm gonna move the camera to catch me while I come over.
And as you get it pulled up, we've addressed this in the earlier lives as we talk about the lies of the Moynihan Report and how gender is made into this fiction through Moynihan's report, through people's buying into the violence of patriarchy, right? So I don't think it's a defrauding, but I would argue that Spillers is pointing us to, right, the nonsensical violence of gender is also the ways that the power still seeps in and the power dynamics are still used as intracommunity violence and intercommunity violence when you think about the ways that African female flesh through time is still subjected to particular types of violence.
Mm. No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. All right, we can move into the next question. Where are the Facebook people at? There's like a handful of y'all watching. Would love to say hello. Hello, how are you doing?
The next question is, if ungendering occurs as the violation of the enslaved African female subject, where/how does gendering occur, according to Spillers? Where does gendering occur, according to Spillers?
So yeah,
So,
she gets into this on page 72. So that last the last paragraph, right, that comes after the quote that you previously read. And she's working through Klein observes this observation that, slavery was there were way more men that were taken than women.
mm-hmm,
But that observation does not change the reality of African women's captivity and servitude in New World communities. But it does provide a perspective from which to contemplate the internal African slave trade, which, according to Africanists, remained a predominantly female market. And we can take this back to a general track book we read, uh, Homegoing by Ya Jesse. I'm trying to stay in frame here. Gotta move this way. Okay. Homegoing by Ya Jesse, and which is told through the lens of two half sisters, one who remains in Ghana and another one who is sold into the slave trade, but both of them come from a servant mother. And so in both of their genealogies, even though the one who comes to America, her genealogy immediately becomes more masculine, right? It's told through a more paternal lens. The one who stays, both of them, for their genealogy within Ghana, was told through the servant woman, because it was most often that the woman was exchanged within the internal slave trade that was happening in Africa.
yeah,
Um,
I'm trying to find this other quote that I did not do a particularly good job of highlighting. Um, Oh, in that second paragraph, also on page 72, Spiller said, I would suggest that gendering takes place within the confines of the domestic, an essential metaphor that then spreads its tentacles for male and female subject over a wider ground of human and social purposes. Domesticity appears to gain its power by way of a common origin of cultural fiction that are grounded in the specificity of proper names, more exactly, a patronymic, which in turn situates those persons it covers in a particular place. So thinking of the cultural fiction of the domestic, which gets into so much of I'm thinking of the backlash you even get in your YouTube videos from the sort of legacy of the cultural fiction of domesticity, which we get into like this idea of like a femininity movement, right? Of like you can, if you adhere to these tenets of what femininity is, which is so tethered to the project of domesticity in the domestic realm, then you are performing womanhood the correct way. And that's a cultural fiction that goes back to the dehumanizing project of the Middle Passage, right? This idea that if you hit the ground running within the violences of patriarchy, you can beat it. And Spillers is like, that's nonsense. It doesn't work. You're still trying to play by this European colonial grammar book, and it's not going to work for you.
mm. Yeah, because our language doesn't even allow for it, right? Like we are and the language that we use around beauty, is the point that you're making, is that it's always a language from the European lens. It's been curated through the lens of the European. And I was like thinking about a book by Bell Hooks. That's not my favorite, so don't do me. But, she's making this argument about beauty and black looks, and about
Mm,
that, do we really have, we don't have language for what ugly really is. And that
yeah.
ugly is only curated as an antithesis to a European understanding of beauty. And so every time we try to perform beauty, we're performing it through a European lens. And that we don't, even when we try to perform being ugly, we're performing ugly through a European lens. And we
Mm,
don't have the language again for, not that we don't have the language for how to identify ourselves as beautiful, but that so much of our language is caught up in a European standard. Even when we talk about culture broadly, the standard is white culture, and everything else fits outside of that. And so we have all this language around subcultures, around our own black culture, and it's not solidified, it's not solid, because the standard is European culture, and black is the most unknown thing to them. And so
and
we
so many Black feminists get into the limits of beauty, right? Like that's Toni Morrison's whole first novel, right? The
mm,
concept of the bluest eye, and who gets to be beautiful and who gets to pray, right? And dedicate themselves to praying their way into beauty through achieving blue eyes. And then like I think Nikki Giovanni has a whole slew of poems on Black love, Black hair, right? Because that's a large theme of the Black arts movement. But then Black feminists come later on and they're like, what are we talking about when we're talking about Black beauty?
mm.
Who are we uplifting when we talk about Black beauty and the Black arts movement? Because then people come back and examine who gets lifted up
Is
as the
why
vocal
we
figure.
constantly replicate the hierarchies of domains of power. Yeah, like we keep up because it's embedded in our language. So even when we start like talking about like the carefree black girl or black women in luxury, we still create these like, and the argument could be made that all our standards skew towards a European understanding that leave so many of our community out of the equation, out of the conversation, out of being included within something that is meant as a pushback to include more. But it doesn't actually include more. And as you were saying earlier, that's why so much of the femininity conversation really, I'm listening to it and all I'm hearing is exclusion, exclusion, exclusion. And then I'm looking at the women that are following it, the black women, and I'm like, do you realize that this language is against you?
Mm,
Like this is not a language that is embracing you. And it's not that, it's not that people are like they don't fit a specific aesthetic, but it is that this language is always going to find a way to tell you that you're the wrong thing.
mhm. We're
And
suspended in this cultural fiction about what it means to be beautiful, what it means to be woman, what it means to be man, what it means to be Black person. Um, and it's forever suspended in the language, forever until we. And this is something that me and Nicole Dr. Carter were stuck on a couple parts ago about like how do we even begin to change that, right? When we are literally, so many of us are stuck in this ongoing violence of colonization through like literal language, like speaking English, speaking Spanish, as much as we want to grasp at other knowledge systems and other ways of being. How do we get there when so much of our like practical understanding is like, how do I bust open the English language when it's literally a colonial tool, right?
this is why we can't really talk about race, right? This is why we cannot. This is one of, and this is why I understand the struggle of the Black American who descended from slavery. But even within that struggle and the movements that have come around that struggle, I'm like, y'all are not doing it right, because we're still repurposing the language of the colonizer, right? Because we literally don't have the language to distinguish ourselves. We don't have the language. And then, when we do have the language, again, like when you think about oh, do I have a culture as a Black American? And often, if we want to get specific, like the ADOS movement, who really has a thing against what I perceive very specifically to be a Nigerian American. But even when you look at, well, what allows a Nigerian American to lay claim to their cultural markers, oftentimes is still embedded in colonialistic language, right? Like even getting to say that I am Nigerian, right, is an output of how colonialism or colonization impacted our societies.
Right, because the borders are fake, baby. Sorry to say. And to even go back there, right, to what Walter Rodney and so many others who study the continent offers, like this idea of Africa.
Can you just start your point over again? Because I think it cut off like right at the beginning.
Got you. So when you talk about even and Spillers gets into the fiction of ethnicity as well, right? Which is where you were going with even being able to call yourself a Nigerian American is still riddled with colonization and imperialism, and that's definitely right, especially when we think about Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, right? Like borders are fake, and borders are fake for more reasons than like our contemporary understanding of children being brutalized by the state at the border. Borders are fake when we think about how Leopold and them and all of these European powers carved up Africa and decided where Nigeria was and decided where Ghana was going to be, right? And even when we get towards independence in the mid 20th century, when countries are renamed and attempt to name themselves, like these colonial debts, the the roots of colonialism still have a hold and still have influence.
Yeah, it's like even when you think about, like, we tend to talk about like the Black American as losing the most within this colonization process, especially around, and really the loss is language. But often, like when I went to Ghana and I went to Togo, we were in like central Togo. What I distinctly remember is like people talking about their own immediate family members, their own ancestors, and how many of them were from other countries, but because of the way that the borders have been created, because of the way classification has been created, that you lose some essence of your own cultural history because you have to identify in such a binary way in order to be able to say, oh, I'm proud of who I am. That you have to give up part of yourself in order to fit into what has been constructed by the colonizer as, okay, this is what you are allowed to identify as. So,
Mm-hmm.
we've all kind of suffered some sort of loss within the way that this language has been constructed, and it uplifts the European, but really dismantles the Black person.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I think there's just something going on with my internet.
got you. I was just gonna say, as we lead into this next question about suspended in the oceanic and what does it mean to be unmade, I think we were already talking about like the consequences of being suspended in the oceanic and what does
Mm-hmm.
it mean to be unmade, right? Because the Middle Passage was way more egregious than I think even people with the deepest sort of historic and archival understanding of it can even imagine. When we talk about the ongoing ramifications, like Alexis Pauline Gumbs recently put out a book that talks about how the Middle Passage changed the feeding patterns of sharks,
Mm.
right? Because of the amount of flesh that was going into the ocean, the amount of people's, right? The amount of Africans who got on the ship and said, you know what, bump being in the hold, I'm going to jump over, right? It changed the feeding patterns of marine mammals. Like, just think about the ongoing ramifications of the Middle
Mm-hmm.
Passage and really sit in. There are whole histories suspended in the oceanic, as Bill was just talking about, the loss of language, the loss of lives and culture. And so much of West African culture did make it through to the Southern United States, right? And it changes and it gets shaped by the experience of Southern chattel slavery. But so much of it is unmade with the flesh in the Middle Passage.
No, I definitely agree. And we deep. I guess we can get into the last question before my internet goes out again. I think it might just have though, because now we're frozen again. But what is missing or obscured from written slave records? What was this notice?
That's on 73 when we get into maybe not your fave, but certainly somebody who you struggle with and you hold that tension of what she lays out. Bell Hooks gets brought into the room on page 73.
Yeah, in the second paragraph. But why she capitalize Bell Hook's name like that?
I was gonna say now. I'm not gonna
Since you was so on point with the stylization of words that you knew what you was doing here.
say
You could not be italicizing and hyphenating and doing everything else and then spell Bell Hooks. Capital letters.
I don't know what was going on in 1987.
Oh yeah, I hit up Dr. Collins and was like, "Do you know Dr. Spillers?" And she's like, "No."
Well,
Because we're trying to get Spillers. She just said she's not in her social circle. That's all she said.
point blank, we're gonna leave it. We're gonna
There's no shade and
leave
taste to that, but it's like, yo,
it.
everyone, just because everyone's a intellectual of the same time period does not necessarily mean that they,
Was kicking in.
you know, yeah. But in that paragraph, it's saying, at any rate, we get very little notion in the written record of the life of women, children, and infants in Middle Passage, and no idea of the fate of the pregnant female captive and the unborn, which startling thematic Bell Hooks addresses in the opening chapter of her pathfinding work. From Hooks' lead. However, we might guess that the reproduction of mothering in this historic instance carries few of the benefits of patriarchalized female gender, which from one point of view is the only female gender there is. Okay, just pull my wig off. Yeah, I mean, because actual liberation and sex positivity, we're still doing it from the male gaze. Like, even when we as like Black women talk about finding joy, or like, not because we're not really talking about finding joy, when we talk about being sexually free, we often talk about it in about like, how do we pleasure men.
Mm-hmm.
And we still are very invested in the male gaze and a patriarchal understanding of sexuality. And so, like, but female gender is, we only have a patriarchal definition of female gender.
That's what Spillers throws on the table. And for those, if you jump to the notes, she is in fact talking about NI women, Black women, and feminism from Bell Hooks when she talks about that pathfinding work. If folks were unfamiliar. Above that part about Bell Hooks, she also mentions that the dominant discourse on the Middle Passage is incomplete because the sexual violation isn't recorded, right? The ways subject.
Yes. All right. I think my internet is about to go out again. We suffered through this. You know what? I just checked. I paid my internet bill. But though there's a house being, it's gentrification. There's a house being built next door to me, and they had to redo the wiring so that house could have electricity. And they did it this week, and my power did go out for half the day. So I apologize, y'all. We might have to come back and redo this again, or we'll revisit this when we start part 3. And
yes.
I'll have my Ethernet cord plugged in that time so we can work around all these technical difficulties. But this is such a good text. And I did a read along yesterday on Instagram, and I'm going to get back into, I'm going to actually now do them on Tuesdays. So I'll be reading the second part of part 1. Because I think people are really, like, I didn't even know this concept of holding tension until, talking to Bry. And so I think a lot of us aren't used to reading text and feeling uncomfortable. Right? We expect to read text and feel like, so enlightened because I entirely agree. Or, so enlightened because I have this really good argument against it. And I think Spillers is definitely like, I didn't even know this shit. Girl. You know what I mean? Like, you really sit there like, dang, is she saying what I think? And it's like, no, she really is saying what you think you don't realize she's saying, you know? Like some of us are really trying to like dig deeper because it's just like, huh? Oh wow. And it really just is a commentary on language, which makes it complex. But thank y'all for joining. I apologize for the botched up. I can't even see the comments now because my internet is so slow. If there have been any comments, but enjoy the rest of y'all Saturday. I actually have to figure this shit out because I have another live for my Patreon in like an hour. So ghetto.
It's all gonna work out. It's all
It
gonna work
is.
out.
All right. Have a good rest of y'all day. Bye.
Bye, y'all.